have C. Robert Cargill as our guest for the latest edition. Hello.
Hi. How's everybody doing?
I'm great. I'm excited, and I think our followers are as well. For those who didn't know, we started doing these on a weekly basis way back when our quarantine and safer at home social distancing started, and we've been doing them every Wednesday ever since. So if you're coming back, welcome back. And if you're joining us for the first time, we're excited to have you. We are going to jump into questions posed and answered in real time. If you are following us on your stream on Facebook, I am told you can post it in the comments section down there somewhere. But if you're watching on Facebook Watch, that section would be over this way. So awesome. We're excited to get to it. My name is Tom Dever. I have been working with ScreenCraft the past couple of years, running their competitions, working with their writers, and having the privilege to work with Mr. Cargill on things such as you've been a jury member of our horror competition in the past, as well as our current horror competition. And we had the privilege of doing a panel with you in the Austin Film Festival in 2018. So always good to see you and great to have you back.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And for those who don't know, Mr. Cargill is a prolific writer, a novelist, podcaster, journalist, critic, and a screenwriter, perhaps best known for Sinister and Sinister 2, as well as Doctor Strange. But for those who maybe don't know, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, how you got into screenwriting, and how long you've been at it?
Well, those are quick, easy questions, certainly. I was a film critic for 10 years. I was working in video stores and just happened to luck in the proper situation where I got asked to be a critic for a small site. Another site really liked my writing, asked me to come on and be their indie guy, Ain't It Cool News, and cover indies, undistributed indies. And that just kind of grew and grew until 10 years later, I had a career as a professional film critic. But I saw that the bottom was going to drop out of the industry. I saw that there wasn't, that corporations were buying up and consolidating, and I knew they were going to start strip mining the IP and the web names and start firing writers. And I just saw that happening, and I was just like, I'm out. I can't do this. And I had seen that coming, and so I started working on a book. And I'd become friends with Scott Derrickson, who was a fan of my film reviews, and we just happened to be in Vegas in the same night, and we were both tweeting about our Vegas adventures. And he said, "Hey, you're in Vegas. You should come and have a drink with me." I'm like, "Absolutely!" And we went out to the Mandalay Bay and had a couple drinks. And he had two different producers coming to him from different directions with this new model, which was essentially, you give us a good idea, we'll give you $1 million and you get final cut and you go make your movie. And then, the movie's already made money based upon foreign sales, based upon your name. So if it doesn't get distributed in the States, it doesn't. So it's up to you to make a good movie. And he wanted to get my professional opinion on an idea he had, and he bounced it off me, and I gave him my professional opinion. And I said, "Oh, hey, I've got an idea that's been banging around my head that I would love your professional opinion on. Would you mind if I bounce it off you?" And he goes, "Go for it." And he's like, "Everybody pitches me once. This is your one chance. Pitch me." And I pitched him Sinister. And he said, "Holy crap. I want to make that movie. This is the movie these guys are looking for." And he had just stopped working with his previous writing partner. And he's like, "Look, I don't have a writing partner right now. Normally, I just pay you $50,000 for your idea. And you'd get a story by credit. But I've read your book, because he had asked to read my book before it was published, and he had read it, and he's like, I know you're a good writer. Would you come and be my writing partner on this? And then if it works out, we'll try writing something else and see what happens." Sure. And 2 weeks into that, he called me up and he's like, "This is the best writing relationship I've ever had. This is great. We just totally jive together. Will you just be my writing partner?" And we've been writing partners for going on for just over 9 years now, ever since.
Yeah. I mean, I obviously I remember Ain't It Cool News. That was the kind of a regular in the feed when I was an intern. So I guess for those who maybe aren't familiar, what was the kind of time frame that this was happening? Would it have been late 2000s, early 2010s?
It was when this was happening, when me and him met. It was January of 2011.
Okay.
So I had just finished my first book, and I was looking to try to get out of the industry.
Mhm.
And sure enough, oddly enough, I signed the deal a week before Cinematical closed its doors, and they let out a bunch of writers, and all of a sudden everybody went, "Oh, this is what you've been talking about." And I'm like, "Yeah, this is." So it was. In fact, I remember sitting around with a bunch of my friends at South by 2011, and I'm like, I really feel like we are at the changing of a guard moment. Like, this is the end
Mhm.
of an era. Is this South by is the last time all of us are going to be together like this? And then sure enough, several places shuttered up, other places
Right.
consolidated, other guys moved on, and it became a very different industry after that.
Sure. So, I guess for those who aren't familiar, what I guess is the core idea of Sinister that you were kicking around when you decided to pitch to him, apparently on the spot on the Vegas Strip, so far as I'm hearing correctly.
Yeah, that is all correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had had a nightmare years before of me going into my attic and finding a box of 8 millimeter films, and I spool one up, and it's the first murder from the movie in Sinister.
Mm,
And that image haunted me, and it stuck with
right.
me. And I was like, since it wouldn't leave a couple weeks later, I'm like, there's got to be a story in here. There's got to be a movie here.
Yeah.
And so I just workshopped it over the course of years, just kicking it around. Like, how do I make this work? How do I make this idea work? So I had put it together as a full on pitch. And
Yeah.
so when I pitched it to Scott, it was mostly in the form that you guys saw it as a film. Scott and I shaped it together. The bones of the story are exactly what I pitched to him.
Sure.
And I had my elevator pitch, of course, which I used with Jason Blum, where I'm sitting across from Jason Blum, and I'm like, those found footage movies? He goes, "Yes, I make them." And I just go, "Well, this is the movie about the guy that finds the footage." And his eyes just go wide, and he goes, "Keep going." And he bought it in the room.
No, that's amazing. That is a very concise sort of description of it, and I'm like still getting excited hearing that pitch. So you and Scott become fast friends, like you said. This is roughly 2011. What sort of and you were living in Austin at the time then as well?
Still am.
So yes, it's
Yeah, I am Austin based.
and I know that Screencraft in particular have writers from all over the states and all over the world. Living testament that you do not have to uproot and live in Los Angeles to make a go of this. But I guess what then you guys became fast friends. You started working on Sinister. How did things change for you then? What was kind of the trajectory to, I suppose, where you are now?
Can you clarify a bit?
I guess so. So Sinister takes off. How does
Mm-hmm.
that change your writing career? What did you start working on then?
Well, that's where everything kind of gets. I have an abnormal career.
Yeah.
Mine is it's one of those that when everything started up and I got my manager was just like, "Hey, by the way, this doesn't normally happen this way, and
Mhm.
everything's going to be very slow from here on out." But what had happened was Blum was very hungry to get his model off the ground. He
Mhm.
knew that the idea of someone finding the found footage and making a movie of that. In fact, what he said in the room is, he's like, that is such a good idea. Someone else is going to have it in 6 months. If we don't make this movie now, someone else is going to make it.
Yeah.
So he fast tracked it. And so I got a manager immediately because Scott's manager really dug my pitch and looked into me and really dug my writing and said, "Oh, I want to represent this guy." So I had a manager, and he started getting me all my people. Well, the thing is that now that I had a movie greenlit, all of a sudden interest in my book was
Mhm.
upped,
Mhm.
because now people are like, "Oh, he's got an Ethan Hawke movie that they're shooting later this year," and they spun that into getting the book sold. So the book got me the clout to write the movie, and then the movie got me the clout to sell the book.
Gotcha.
And so all of a sudden I get a 2-book deal with Harper Voyager, and Scott and I make Sinister, and then we start getting writing gigs. We start getting offers on stuff that just kind of snowball. So we get offered movies like Deus Ex and a couple other movies that nothing ever came of. And we carved out a small space of time to write a draft of Sinister 2.
Mhm.
And then we got offered the chance to go out for a Marvel movie.
Mhm.
And in fact, Scott called me up and he was like, so Cargill, we're getting offered a chance at a superhero movie. And I was like, Scott, what superhero movie are we right for? And he goes, Doctor Strange. And I'm like, damn it, that's the one. Yes, absolutely, yes. We should go for this. And we actually had a chance at another gig, and we had a chance at a sure thing with this gig, or we could have a shot at having Doctor Strange. And we decided to swing for the fences and go for Doctor Strange. And from that point on, once that movie came out, we were full on established, and it's been typical Hollywood stuff ever since.
Sure. I would say I highly recommend Doctor Strange. I was about to say if you haven't seen it, but I'm not sure if there's anyone who hasn't. It seems like most people on Earth have seen the Marvel films. So no, that's fantastic. I guess I can turn it over to the questions here in just a second, because the first one is more or less the only other question I have, and kind of what you already covered, which is saying, how did you get your first break in the industry? And I know you told the story about connecting with Scott, but I feel like there was a lot of work that kind of went into it beforehand, obviously. What was it that you were doing so much that you kind of set yourself up for success in that moment when opportunity did knock in a casino on a random night?
Well, the thing is that somebody just asked a question in the feed that I think plays fully into this, and asked what how much does luck play into it versus talent? And they both play in equally. But the thing is when you get lucky, you have to be talented.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have done the work. One of the big things that I did that prepared me for this, the reason why I managed to get myself into the position that I'm in, is that both while I was working at the video store and while I was writing reviews, I was treating it as an education.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't treating them as jobs as much as they were education that was paying.
Mm-hmm.
And I was trying to learn not only about story, but how audiences connect with story. So when I was working in the video store, I was always asking people, hey, what did you think of this movie? Why'd you like it? Why didn't you like it? Trying to figure out, gauge people's tastes, figure out what people liked and why. What point in the movie did they tune out or turn off to it and just like, oh, this movie's bad. And I did the same thing as a film critic. And so I was always constantly trying to figure out how best to connect with an audience so that I could tell stories to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was doing that. And all the while I was writing and failing. And it's one of the things I talk about all the time. You're going to write a lot of garbage. You're going to write a lot of crap. You're going to write a lot of things that sound like a good idea at first and then weren't a good idea at all. And you're going to learn from that. And you're going to learn to pick up on the clues early. Like it's one of those things that I like at this point in my career, I don't like doing rewrites very often. And the reason I don't like doing rewrites is because oftentimes producers have certain ideas in their head and certain sequences or things in the script that they really like and they want to keep. And those things are the things that are getting in the way of the thing being good. That even though they like them, they're in the wrong place. They don't belong there. I know with Doctor Strange, there was one sequence in particular everyone was married to, and we spent like 3-4 months trying to write around it and get it to work in the context of the film, because it just didn't belong there in the story that they were telling before I came aboard. And what you end up getting is you end up having to rewrite these elements that it's very hard to figure out. Whereas I prefer to go into be in the beginning, because I can figure those things out beforehand, because I've tripped up so many times and I've screwed up so many times and I've failed so many times that I've recognized, oh, hey, this character here, if we don't hit this note, and this note, this character isn't going to work.
Yeah.
I can be like, oh, hey, because me and Scott are dealing with a script right now, and there's a certain element that I was just like, hey, by the way, we ran into this problem on a previous script. And so what I want to make sure is that we end up here and do this, because if we don't do this, then we're going to have a huge question here. And, and Scott and I had that conversation today, and Scott was just like, oh, right. Oh, yeah. Yes. Let's avoid that. Let's fix that right here. And you just start seeing the road bumps before they come. And that all comes from failure. That does not come from success. Success does not teach you anything except how hollow success can be. Failure is the greatest teacher. As Yoda said, that is what that is it. And so you only learn from screwing up or getting things wrong, or the various times things don't go over well. That's where all that comes from. So I spent a lot of time failing. I spent a lot of time writing stuff that no one's ever going to read. I have 3 novels no one will ever read again, sitting in a cyber drawer. I've got a handful of scripts that nobody's ever going to need to see, because I look at them and go, yeah, there's nothing here to mine. It was a great experience writing it, but you sometimes have to know when to cut your losses and move on. And so I did all this writing and preparation and thinking. And with Sinister, I just spent a lot of time, in spare time thinking about the story and trying to figure out how, answer the question. So I have this dream. So let's walk through it. I have this dream. There's a box in the attic full of film, and there's a murder on it. The first question: who put the box there? Well, you got to kind of figure that out. Why would they leave the box there? If you have a character that finds the box, why don't they give the box to the police? You start asking yourself all these questions and trying to find the best, most interesting way into that story. And so I just broke that story down until I had it, and then bounced it off of, my creative friends that, I bounced things off of, and they would give me their notes and they'd ask their questions. And it's like, oh, I didn't think of that question. And then you start trying to answer that question and, deal with their criticisms and go, oh, well, that's interesting, but this is why that doesn't work. And you're like, oh, and you just sharpen it and hone it until you get to the point when you pitch it to somebody and they get goosebumps. And I had that with Sinister a couple of times where I pitched it to people and they got goosebumps and they're like, oh man, dude, you're going to make that movie. Oh, and once you have that, when you connect with people, when they really respond, that's when you know you've got something.
Sure. I think that's really crucial to, you don't really know until you actually write it, right? Until you're actually sort of seeing it. You have to kind of get it onto the page, just because I do think of, your tweet, you're always so great at kind of putting forth this sort of motivational and inspiring advice for the writing. And the top of your feed is, you need to finish it. Like, it cannot just be a dream. And as great as the idea for Sinister was, at some point you did have to put it onto the page and execute it. And I think that's just great that you tie that in with, like, it's okay to fail. Maybe it's not going to be great when you get it on the page, but it can't get any better if you're not going to put it on the page in the first place. So
absolutely. You have to 100% finish the thing. Even if the first draft is complete unreadable garbage, unreadable garbage is easier to rewrite than the blank page is to forge it into its own thing. So it's mandatory.
Absolutely. So that was a great question. That was from Marie. I don't think I called her out. Question from Roslyn. You obviously have simultaneously written, your produced works, a low-budget Blumhouse horror film and also this gigantic superhero film. Her question is, do you have the issue with people sort of, it's hard to get producers to see you as being able to write multiple genres? And I think the question is, how do you balance that perception of being able to write in different spaces and styles?
That is a super great, very tough question. It's really, the thing is when you get in early in your career, you absolutely want people to think of you for one thing. And that's something not enough people say. No one wants to be pigeonholed. Everyone wants to write everything. I know great writers who have gotten pigeonholed in the worst ways. Tim McCandless, a wonderful human being, writer of the Iron Giant and writer-director of Secondhand Lions, has a career writing a whole bunch of stuff, wrote some dark, gritty dramas, wrote some horror stuff. Great, great genre guy. But as soon as he did the 1-2 punch of Iron Giant and Secondhand Lions, nobody wanted him to write horror or rated R stuff anymore. They're like, what, the Secondhand Lions guy, the Iron Giant guy? No. And it really bummed him out. By the same token, he then spent the next 15 years, the end of his career, writing constantly for family entertainment because he was always at the top of the list. Whenever they had a new property, they were like, ooh, let's see if we can get Tim McCandless. And now he was at the tail end of his career at that point. But when you're early in the career, there are legitimate, literal lists, actual lists that agents have, that managers have, that producers have, of names to go to if you want to do a specific thing. So say you've got an IP. You're say one that gets bounced around a lot is Hellraiser. I know there's people have been trying to get Hellraiser rebooted for a while. So they want to reboot Hellraiser. Well, who do you go to? Well, the first thing they look at is, well, what's our budget? You know, how much are we going to be able to make this for? Because if you've got a big budget for it, then you go for your A-list names. You go, ooh, can we get James Wan and Lee Winnell to work on this? Can we get C. Robert Cargill and Scott Derrickson to work on this? Can we get Benson and Moorhead to come in on this? You know, your names of guys who have produced really cool stuff, but are going to cost you something. Yeah. And then they go, oh, no, we're looking to make this for 10, maybe $15 million. And they're going to be looking at what we call younger writers. Now, if you ever hear about looking for young writers, young is code. They don't actually mean young writers. They mean inexpensive writers. And that's your you know, your younger, you know, your more inexperienced writers. And they've got a list of people like, oh, this guy made this indie film. This woman wrote this great horror film. And they'll go through that list and they'll be trying to find someone that fits Hellraiser. Oh yeah, she made that really cool, weird, psycho, crazy Babadook movie. Let's see if we can get her to do Hellraiser. So they do go to that list, and so you do want to be known for something. If you don't want to be known for something, the key is once you get juice, you know, having made something or produced a couple of things, then you do your own project that is something a little different. Now, not too wildly different, because that will end up confusing investors and they'll be like, ooh, you're not like, you write horror movies. Why would we produce your romantic comedy? I don't understand. What is anybody going to go and see Robert Cargill's rom-com? I don't know. So you want to kind of like incrementally move away from that other thing and go back and forth. And that's pretty much what Scott and I did. You know, we wrote a couple horror things, a couple sci-fi things. Then we did the big superhero movie, which had some horror elements. So that's how we got in the room and we pitched it and got it. And now that we've done the big superhero movie and we've done the small horror movie and we've worked on a couple of other things separately, people go, oh, these guys are just good at genre. So if it's a genre movie, they're good for that. By the same token, could Scott and I get hired for a period romantic film? I don't know. So we're still kind of pigeonholed into the genre, but we broadened that. So that's the way you want to go about it. You want to be incremental with it and do stuff that stays in similar spaces. And in that, demonstrate your skill set. And you will reach a point where you get like James Wan, where James Wan was, you know, a horror and gritty action guy. And then they gave him a $200 million Fast and Furious movie. And then they gave him Aquaman. And now James Wan can do whatever he wants because he's shown that he can do stuff all across the board.
I think that's really interesting that you point out it wasn't just like it wasn't just overnight you wrote low budget horror film and then suddenly getting handed the superhero, that it was incremental and that there were kind of similar components to transitioning to sci-fi, and the elements of that horror film you had shown that you were able to do them. So it almost kind of speaks to finding what you're good at and seeing how that transcends across different genres and styles.
Yeah.
Let's see. I guess speaking on horror here, and a little bit of a deviation from career advice, Joshua says, do you have a fine line between fright and exploitation, and boundaries that you won't cross as a writer when writing horror films?
Oh, that's a good question. I draw the line personally at moral stuff. There are certain things I don't enjoy seeing on film, and I would never write those.
Mhm.
Um, we especially live in an era where we have a much more heightened awareness about the message that we're sending, because this is very much a time where message matters.
Mhm.
There are periods of time where cinema just becomes very much fire and forget, and you can be audacious and outlandish, and people take it as enjoying the shock for the sake of the shock. But we do not live in those times right now. We are in one of the periods of very much the importance of the message. And so I certainly wouldn't at this point write anything that goes against my personal beliefs,
Mhm.
or really anything that would socially offend. I'm not really. I don't think this is a time for social offense in that way. I think this is a time for telling stories that definitely matter, but
Right.
that I think there's a tone deafness to the people who are like, oh, hey, I can get a lot of attention if I say these outlandish or crazy things. And,
Mhm.
some of us are just like, no. To answer the question between fright and exploitation, the question comes down to, does it serve the story?
Mhm.
I think there's a great, great, great example of that. The two I Spit on Your Grave movies, the original in the 70s, which is clearly gross, disgusting exploitation. And then you have the remake from, I think, 2010, in which it cut out the exploitive elements to tell the story. And while the same story elements happen, they aren't they aren't in the same way. The point in that movie is not to show an attractive woman naked and being brutalized. The brutalization action, actually, none of those elements really happen on screen and
Right.
lead to storytelling later. And so if you watch those two movies, which I don't necessarily recommend, because I don't think the original is worth watching,
Mhm.
because it is pure gross exploitation. But those two films really kind of show that line that, hey, if this thing that is crazy or audacious actually serves the story and moves the story along in a believable way, I think that counts as fright. But if it is just there to be gross or to titillate, then that's when you're clearly in exploitation territory.
Right. And that really ties back to what you were saying earlier about that sequence in Doctor Strange that you had to kind of write around, right? That it's like it was not the right way to go for the story. You had to service the story, as cool as that sequence was. Doing what is right for the story is ultimately what should be guiding you in the writing process. And I think this ties in a little bit to what Mike is asking, which is, do you have anything to keep in mind that is unique to screenwriting for horror specifically?
Yes.
Awesome.
There needs to be something scary every 10 pages.
Mm,
That is the number one rule of horror screenwriting. Every 10 pages, something scary. Now, you get leeway in the first act. The
mhm,
first act is the one, and that's why a lot of horror has a cold open.
mhm,
You'll have this thing where you'll have someone running through the woods, they'll get killed, then we cut to our characters. Or
right,
like in Sinister, where we open up with one of the films.
right,
You have to, if you do that and go, hey, this is the kind of movie this is, and this is the kind of horror you're expecting, let's get to our characters and let's meet our contestants. And then you get a first act before you
right,
have to get scary again. But if you go after your first act without having anything scary, the audience is getting real bored. And if they go more than 10 minutes without something scary happening, they forget they're in a horror movie.
right.
So I personally, this is my advice. I've had this argument with a number of amazing screenwriters, by the way. Me and Kevin Williamson, not Kevin Williamson, Kevin Andrew Walker had it out at a panel one year over this. I think cat scares are the worst thing in horror. I avoid them like the plague. A cat scare is, of course, based on the classic. I think something scary is going to happen, and then a cat jumps out of the closet, and you go, and everybody jumps, and then it's a cat in the closet. I think that ruins one of the great things about horror films is great horror films are rewatchable, and you'll be rewatching them for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. We still watch, it is 2020, and we still watch The Thing, which is 39 years old. We
Right.
still watch The Shining, which is 40 years old.
Mhm.
And we go back and revisit them. And when we know which scares are coming up aren't really scares, that scene just then kind of lies there limp. And cat scares are only good for a first watch or when you've completely forgotten the film. So I always recommend that every scare beat you have is authentic, is genuine, isn't cheap,
Mhm.
is earned. And if you do that, the audience will constantly be in a state of heightened fear.
Mhm.
The other final thing that I would say specific to horror screenwriting is don't be afraid of comedy. Avoid slapstick, but
Yeah.
character comedy, jokes, little bits of comedy here and there lets
Mhm.
the audience laugh and they get relaxed. And once they're relaxed after laughing, that tension starts building again. And it's tension release. Tension release is the core of a good horror movie. And horror is a great way to do that without just making the audience jump constantly. I mean, that's what we did with Deputy So-and-so and Sinister,
Mhm.
where, we've got this kind of, there's a scene in the movie that me and Scott call our Coen brothers scene, where it's, a writer and a deputy in the hallway talking about whether or not you'd hear squirrels in the attic, and that everybody always laughs at that scene. And
Right.
it's stuck between two big scares. And so as a result, the audience gets comfortable and then that tension starts building again. And, and those are the three big things I recommend for horror screenwriters.
Yeah, I mean, now that you mentioned that, I think that you'll start to really notice that in horror films. And a famous example that when you said that made me think of it is in Scream. I believe the big note that they had was adding the scene where Henry Winkler's character is killed, because otherwise it was this like 25-minute stretch where nothing had happened. And obviously a great example of balancing the comedy. Do you have a process by which you determine what is scary? Is that really just looking inward at what frightens you, or is there a way of like finding how to get that out onto the page for horror writers?
I mean, yeah. First of all, if it scares you, it scares someone else.
Mm,
Like if you've got a fear, I guarantee you, someone else. You know what I was always afraid of as a kid is that the lawnmower was going to cut my hand off when I was working it, or I'd run over my feet, and so I put that into Sinister, and
yeah,
that's the one thing everyone comes up to me and goes, "Oh, that's that lawnmower scene. Oh, oh." You don't even see anything in the lawnmower scene, but that's the beauty of how Scott shot it, in which you think you saw something,
right.
but you see a lawnmower go towards a dummy, and then the soundtrack shrieks at you, and the whole audience goes
Yeah.
ah.
Yeah, you're actually like making me cringe talking about it. So that it works.
Yeah, yeah, but otherwise, it's just it's learning the pacing, it's learning the beats of it, it's learning about especially, and this is another thing in a script with horror. Make sure your action lines, stagger them. Stagger them, knowing how long they're kind of going to take. The weird thing about horror, unlike any other genre,
Mhm.
is that a horror movie will always end up longer than its screenplay,
Mhm.
unless everybody goes by the 1 page equals
Right.
1 minute. It doesn't
Yeah.
work that way in horror unless you end up writing stuff that gets really cut out.
Yeah.
We wrote a 105-page script for Sinister, and the first cut of the movie was 2 hours and 10 minutes.
Wow.
It's you write, he walks down the hallway. Well, that's 30 seconds sometimes. That's creeping in the dark. And so don't be afraid to take your time in that script, because, by the way, that also, as a writing narrative, builds tension. That's how us novelists build tension in in a novel. When you in a novel, if you want to set the audience at ease, you write these long, lingering sentences. You take your time,
Mhm.
big blocky paragraphs. But when the action starts happening, the sentences get shorter and shorter and shorter until you've got 2-word sentences going down your page, and the audience is on the edge of their seat. It works that way when people are reading your screenplays as well. Also, another weird little thing is you underline a really big scare. You don't do it for every scare. If
Mhm.
you've done it more than 3 times in a script, you're really pushing it. But when it's a really big scare, you put that in there, not just to highlight it for the reader, but because a lot of readers and producers will be skimming, or they'll be paying attention to other stuff while they're reading. And then they'll see this big underlined point and they'll be, I got to go back. And they'll go back and read that entire scare beat because they
Right.
know something's coming and they know it's important. But really what it comes down to is just, watching a lot of horror movies, and knowing what it is that scares audiences. Go watch horror movies in the theater when you can again, and
Mhm.
listen to the audience. Listen for when they jump. Listen for how they react. Listen for when, that guy three aisles over is going, nope, nope,
Yeah.
nope. And pay attention to those and see how those beats are constructed, and rewatch that movie later with knowing where the audience reacted and go, why did they react this way, and pick it apart
Mhm.
so that you can then reverse engineer it into your own scares.
Right. So we're at a little past the halfway point, so I do want to take this chance to welcome anyone who is just joining us or perhaps missed the beginning. Again, really quick reminder, we are answering questions with C. Robert Cargill. If you have questions, please do it in the comment section, either down below here or off to the side over there. Let's see. From Benim is asking, do you have a writing routine with your partner? Does it change on every project, or have you found a process that works?
We have a core process that works, and it changes up every once in a while. Every project is different and has different challenges and requirements. And Scott and I have fallen into this groove of what parts of the process we break apart based
Mm,
upon where our personal talents lie.
mm,
Being a writing partner is exactly like being in a marriage. Exactly. The relationship is pretty much the same.
mm,
You each have your strengths and your weaknesses. You learn how to speak in shorthand to one another. You learn
mm,
how to rely on one another and trust one another. Um, and so like we'll break things apart at first. Essentially, how Scott and I tend to do it is Scott is he's a big visual thinker. Those visuals in Doctor Strange came out of his head.
mm,
I came up with a bunch of the stuff, but he was like things like what we call the magical mystery tour, where Strange goes through the universe,
right.
and the space time chase completely came out of images from Scott's head.
Mm,
That's just how he thinks. And so he's always, when we work on a project, he goes and starts breaking down an outline and a structure that he wants, and starts putting in big set pieces and coming up with these big inventive ideas, while I start breaking down the characters. And I start thinking of the complexities of the characters and what are we going to do with nuance and what are we going to say outright, and working that. And then we start working that together with the outline and breaking down the outline. And then what we do is we just start writing. And typically I'm usually the guy who writes page one.
yeah.
Like I just start from page one and I write a bunch of pages, and then I send him what we call the master, and I send the file to him and I say, you have the master. And then I don't touch it until he sent it back to me.
Mm,
And then he will do his writing on it and send me the master. And then we lather, rinse, and repeat until we've got until we've got a draft. And then we both sit down and read the draft, and then get on Skype and talk about it and talk about what we think needs to be done, where we need to fix it. Then we do our edit. And once we're comfortable with it, we have what we call the wife read. And our wives then read the script and give us their notes.
yeah.
We hand it to our assistants, and our assistants give us their feedback.
Yeah.
And then we take another pass at it, and then we hand it to our people, and then our people give us their feedback. And based upon that feedback, we do any more polishes, and then it's time to hand off to either try to get it sold if it's an original thing, or hand it off to the producers and let them have their notes. And that's pretty much our process.
I saw one question in the comments there. How many do you have on average? How many rewrites it takes to get something to the point where you feel confident in sending it to your reps to try and sell it?
Nope. There's no such thing. Anyone that tells you a rough number is either really, really fastidious about how they do things, or lying. I mean, it's just straight up. There are times, there are times where, you know, the first or second draft is the one because you spent so much time cracking it. As I talk about on my show, for those of you that have listened, this will sound familiar. There's two types of people in the world. There's planners and pantsers. And people, the big argument in the writing community is which is better. And the answer is neither. Planners who plan out everything in advance, much like me and Scott, don't do as much rewriting because we've already figured out all our problems beforehand. Right. Pantsers sit down and take the idea and just start writing. And then as they run into problems, they have to rewrite as they go along, or they go back and have to do drastic rewrites. And so there's no telling. It's all based upon how much work you put in at the beginning. It takes about the same amount of time for everybody. You know, right. Scott and I have an average of what it takes us to write a script from beginning to end. And it usually takes us about 5 weeks from the beginning of the process to the end of the process. Sure. For that first draft. But that's, you know, what it is. But how many drafts we've literally turned in, you know, we submitted Sinister and that was our second draft. We did our first draft and we had our wife, you know, read and then submitted it to our agents. They loved it and it moved on down the line. And then we did a rewrite in between there. And then of course we did slight rewriting on set and that's it. I think all told there's 3 or 4 functionally different versions of Sinister out there. Wow. Doctor Strange on the other hand was, you know, a year and a half of constant rewriting, you know, from the minute I came on in January to the moment I walked off the set, I had been rewriting that whole time. So there's never any telling.
I think that the comparison you made to a marriage is really interesting. So I guess with that lens is how I ask, with a writing partner, how often do you find sort of like fundamental disagreements about something, and how do you resolve that as a creative team?
Well, it was a lot more in the beginning. The thing is it comes down to trust. You know, in the beginning, Scott and I both had very different, you know, viewpoints. I came from the craft from the position of a critic. He came from the position of a director. And then we both met in the middle and argued it out and sussed it out. But over time, we have both had those experiences where we have clearly seen that the other really knows what they're talking about, especially in certain issues. And when that person raises a voice, the first thing we do now is go, okay, explain it to me. And it's not like, prove it to me. It's explain it to me. You're clearly seeing something I'm not seeing. So let me hear your argument. And then if we still disagree at that point, then we share our own details. And oftentimes that conversation is a short period of time. We just had one of those today where I had a fundamental, we're working on a rewrite and I had a fundamental disagreement with a element in the script. And how something was treated in the first act. And I was bumping on it. And I was just like, yeah, this isn't working. And this is why it isn't working. And so in the rewrite, I've changed it. And Scott was like, okay, why did you change this? I kind of like this. Why is this way? And then I explained it to him and he goes, oh, wait, no, that's right. Oh, yeah, no, that's exactly, we were going to run into that problem 3 months down the road developing this. Yeah, no, let's change that now. He's like, and then he started going, oh, well, if we do that, then let's make sure we change this point and this point and this point further down. So it's just all about listening to one another and trusting one another. If you don't trust one another, then you are going to have more arguments. But also learn where the weaknesses are in your partner, but more specifically, learn where the weaknesses are in you. Know where your partner is much better at this than you are, and trust them to go ahead and do it and then help improve their work there rather than trying to work that out. The other big thing is, the big rule is, do not be precious. Absolutely do not be precious. Both of your names are going on that script. At the end of the day, nobody knows if I wrote 95% of a script and Scott wrote 5%, or Scott wrote 95 and I wrote 5%. I still get the credit of being half that writer. It's one of those things. Scott, me, and John Spates all did a lot of work on Doctor Strange. Every single one of us contributed a large amount to Doctor Strange. But when you see me written about in the trades or whatever, see Robert Cargill, writer of Doctor Strange. Yeah. So all that matters is that it's good. Right. That's the key. So make sure it is the best script it can be. And if your name's going to be on it, but don't worry about making sure you've done enough or adding to stuff that doesn't need your voice there, because if it's perfect, let it remain perfect. Even if you didn't get it, you will get credit for it.
Right. Really love what you said about trusting communication, and you kept saying a partner. I know you were talking about a writing partner, but a lot of that could translate to good marriage advice as well. Not really ScreenCraft's for domain, but a good lesson nonetheless. Where I just had it, Aaron, and I know you talked a little bit about this with just hearing how you pitched Sinister, even still after the fact, I'm like, wow, that's a great pitch. Do you have any bits of advice for how to have a successful pitch?
Yeah. Divorce yourself from the material. That is the biggest thing, and it is the biggest mistake people make. They fall in love with their own idea, their own story, and they forget how to sell it because they feel like they've got to give all of it out there. We got to put it all in there. Where do I cut? And no, where do you cut? You cut all of it. The key to a great pitch is it is exactly like trying to convince a friend to watch a movie you've just seen. We've all had that. We saw this movie on Netflix and oh my God, it's so good. How do I convince that person to watch it without spoiling everything, but giving them enough of the hook to make them want to sit down and watch it? That's what a great elevator pitch is right there. It's, what I was talking about earlier, those found footage movies. Well, this is the movie about the guy that finds the found footage. That is technically true about Sinister, but there's a lot more to that. But once you hear that, you're like, oh, what's the they want to know what's the footage? What's the monster? What's the, what is this? And then that's when you have your basic pitch, which is the story, which I'm going to walk you beginning to end. And that's where you tell only the important beats, everything you would need. And in this case, it's like telling a joke. We've all heard that joke that has 10 details too many, and it's like, get to the punchline. That's what you want to do in your pitch. It's just like telling a joke. But some jokes need to have a bit of information in there. You need to have a bit of padding. You need to understand the characters a bit. So that's what it is. It's like telling a joke, but at the end of the joke, instead of laughing, the people go, oh my God, I want to make that movie. That is the reaction you're looking for. The reaction is you pitch, and then the producers in the room, they all look at each other and they go, that sounds amazing. Let's make that movie. That's what you're hoping to get. And so the elevator pitch is like pitching a friend on getting them to watch a movie without spoiling it for them. And the full-on pitch is structured like a joke.
Right. Do you practice that beforehand to kind of see who's responding? No,
not anymore. Like that's really one of those things. Some people do practice. I strongly recommend against practicing too much, because what you end up with is it sounding rehearsed. And you end up with a pitch that it sounds like you're reading off a page. You want it to sound natural, because what you're trying to project when you do any meetings, any pitch, you are trying to project absolute confidence, not arrogance, confidence. And that confidence is, I know this story, I know how to tell this story, and I'm the right and only person who can tell this story my way. And so it's not, it can't be rehearsed. If it's rehearsed, nobody knows how good you are. But if it sounds like it's off the cuff and you're telling the story, it's coming out of your head, you see it, you're telling them as you're seeing it, they're going to be seeing it themselves, and they're going to feel comfortable with you telling that story, because clearly you understand it. You're not you didn't have to rehearse it to share it. You understand all of these elements and why they're there.
And for that story, I see a question from Christopher, and this is actually one I see from ScreenCraft writers quite a bit. How much does structure and plot points pay into your development of a script? Is that something that you're aware of, or is it not? Is it really just not part of the thought process in developing your story?
Keenly aware.
Okay.
Keenly aware. I think, and the thing is Save the Cat is the Hollywood template. And it is a book everyone should read and then throw out most of it. I mean, that's the big thing. A lot of people don't like it. But the thing is basic story structure is a key element that you want to have built your story around. I just recently did an episode on this on my podcast. I believe, one of the biggest problems that most screenwriters have is they get into the second act slump.
Yep.
And I believe the reason they're in the second act slump most of the time is because they haven't figured out what they're doing with their false victory first defeat false victory, which happens around in a screenplay around page 45, which is you're into fun and games, in the second act, and then they've either succeeded at something and it's like, oh, we're gonna win this, or they fail at it, because that sets the tone for the rest of the second act, and how they rebuild or recover from that or move on from that defines this whole second half of the second act. And that comes from understanding the structure. So the main beats you always want to focus on is, of course, inciting incident, somewhere around page 10, first act break, somewhere around page 25, false victory, first defeat, somewhere around page 45, midpoint somewhere between 50 and 60, low point somewhere around 75, and then kick into high gear somewhere around, into the third act, somewhere around page 90. You focus on those beats and know what major elements of the story go there. And then it's like a roadmap. You don't necessarily know all the other details that are going to fill in there, but while you fill that in, how you're going to hit those points. And that's how I approach it. And that's how I end up not having to do tons of rewriting on a lot of the things, because once you hit that structure, you also can learn how to subvert that structure, because the key to three act structure is the fact that this is what we are accustomed to as people who are dipped in story, watch movies, watch television. We read books. We understand three act structure through and through, and the audience knows what's coming. So if you set them up with what they think is coming and subvert that by coming out of left field with something else that's better than what they're expecting, they'll be reeling and going, "Oh my God, my mind was thinking this was going to happen, and this happened instead, and whoa, and now I don't know what's going to happen next." And that's really the key. You cannot subvert structure without understanding structure. So I'm always keenly aware. One of my personal habit, my little nerdy thing that I do that annoys my wife, is I will pause the movie at the end of the first act. Oftentimes when a first act impresses me, I will pause the movie to see exactly what minute the first act ends at, to see how long it took for us to get into the story, because I'm always marveling at really well-crafted first acts. Sure. And so I track that, because you will be surprised how many movies, can get away with an amazing amount. Like one of my favorite weird details is Escape from New York. The first act ends at minute 17. By minute 17, he's in the hang glider and going into New York. Like that's all been settled. And now you're into it. That is such a lean first act, and it's a lean first act in which the protagonist doesn't even speak till I think minute 7. Right. So we've been with him 10 minutes before he's thrust into the second act. I find that fascinating. So I'm always tracking structure in movies, and seeing how they break structure. A great movie, if you want to confound 3-act structure entirely, go watch Infinity War. Infinity War is a movie in which the third act starts an hour and a half in, and it's a 2.5-hour movie. It is literally an hour of third act. It is unbelievable, and it works. Subverting that can totally work if you know how to go about that properly. And so I'm always thinking about structure.
Sure. And to what you're saying, that of course you don't have to adhere to it, but you do have to understand what you're not adhering to necessarily if you're going to deviate from it. And I think speaking a little bit to what you were talking about earlier, Chaco is asking, did you have a particular failure that you learned from the most? Which is kind of tying us back to what we talked about here at the top of our session.
God, there's a couple. I mean, I've learned a lot. I mean, I would say the biggest failure that I learned from is my very first novel. And there's an old saying by Ray Bradbury: if you want to be a novelist, sit down, write your first novel, then go into your backyard, bury it, and go back in the house and write your first novel. That is I learned so much from having written a book. And I'm like, I've written a book. And then it's like, it's crap. It's unsalvageable. And why is it unsalvageable? And breaking that apart. I would also say, I learned a lot from Sinister 2. Sinister 2, was financially successful and made its money back and then some. And, I get royalty checks from it regularly because it's in rotation on cable, but it's not the movie any of us really hoped it would be. We were all disappointed in how it came out. And I learned a lot about the process of taking the script to screen, and things that I should do and fights that I should fight harder for, fights that I shouldn't fight, and things that I should have gotten on the page beforehand. And that's, it was a big learning experience, and making a film that's out there in the world that you are disappointed in, is not a fun feeling, but it is a very, very big learning experience.
So believe it or not, we're already down to our final 5 minutes. So I am trying to, I want to get to as many of these as possible.
All right, let's do rapid fire.
Yeah.
Lightning round.
There was one that I'm losing, but it was saying, if you could write the sequel to any film that has not yet gotten one, what would it be?
Oh, I don't know. Sequel to one that hasn't gotten one?
Yeah, what a sequel in 2020 is maybe a better question.
Yeah, no, I have, I mean, I guess if I had to choose one, I would do, no, I really wouldn't do that either. I don't have a good answer. There's no movie I'm dying to do a sequel for that I can think of off the top of my head.
Sinister 3, then, I think, is the...
Yeah, no, I don't. I'm not interested in Sinister 3. With Sinister 2, we played around with everything we kind of wanted to. There's someone who brought a really interesting idea for Sinister 3, and we'll see if we can develop that. But I don't know. I don't even know if there's a market for a Sinister 3 right now.
One last one I saw in there, and I want to tie this in because obviously you are once again on the jury of our horror screenwriting competition. Early deadline is tomorrow. Super excited to dive in and read those scripts. If you had, I think the way they phrased it was a bit of tough love advice. Is there any final bit that you have for aspiring screenwriters that are trying to break in and get that opportunity? Or maybe something you wish someone had told you sooner?
That I don't know. The first one I can answer. I wish someone had told me sooner. There's like that's an hour long answer. That's all the mistakes that I've made in the last decade. It's the big thing is don't be too proud. I think there's a lot of screenwriters. The thing is that one of the big keys with screenwriters is very rarely does anybody recognize who the screenwriters are. Almost nobody pays attention to it. Even the people that you would think pay attention to it don't pay attention to it. So you're allowed to screw up a lot. And also nobody cares if you cut your teeth on what would be considered low rent stuff. A lot of people want to come out of the gates swinging and write their masterpiece up front, and you don't get to do that. It's a process of learning, and sometimes you do low budget movies. Sometimes you do weird sequels. Don't be afraid to take anything that pays and that will give you a chance to work, because in the industry, everyone understands that. They know that, oh, hey, yeah, this person's written 3 movies for direct-to-video companies or indies. And the question is, well, what script is going around now? What's their script they're selling? That's what matters. And that's really the thing. Also, the other big thing, the biggest advice anyone ever gave to me was the greatest thing about being a screenwriter is you can always write your way out of writer jail. Yeah. Directors have to convince somebody to give them money to make a movie to get out of director jail, but all you need is a great script, and you could have written for example, here's a great example. Look at Craig Mazin. Craig Mazin is a well-respected screenwriter. He's got a great podcast, but if you look at his body of work, it is the type of stuff that critics have turned their nose up at for 20 years. he went 20 years making movies that critics loathed. That in fact, at one point somebody was making fun of him and said that if you added all the Rotten Tomato scores together, he still wouldn't be fresh. And then he goes and writes Chernobyl, and now it's like, oh, that's what he's capable of. Oh, so he's no longer that comedy guy that writes, that wrote Rocket Man, not the recent Rocket Man, the one with the fart jokes in spacesuits. Now he's the guy who wrote this critically acclaimed, amazing HBO series. And that's how people are going to think about him. And when he walks into an office, that's who they're looking at. Not 20 years of comedies, but the guy who wrote this amazing piece. And so that's very much what screenwriting can be, is that don't get your head wrapped around too much in, I want to write prestige pieces. You might get there. But if you want to be a working screenwriter, take the work that comes your way, do the absolute best job you can, always give 100%, leave it on the field, and then move on and try to get the next thing.
Awesome. So believe it or not, we are at 6 p.m. And I think obviously, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you everyone who tuned in. I know a lot of us are stuck at home and doing our best to get through this. I guess if I did have a final question for you, any recommendations, anything we should check out since we're at home and have the time to be streaming and watching films or series?
Well, I mean, one thing I'll mention is if you enjoyed listening to me for an hour, I have a podcast called Right Along with Dave Chen, wherever you get your podcasts. We're, I think, 60 episodes deep. It's 10, 20-minute episodes where we talk about a single topic and just a nugget full of advice before you move on to write. Also, checking things out, I just saw Extraction, which I really, really quite enjoyed. Really interesting film that it's the new one produced by the Russos and starring Chris Hemsworth. And if you enjoy like John Wick style movies, that's exactly what this is. It's a stuntman turned director making a really interesting stunt movie. And I enjoyed that quite a bit. I'm going to make a really oddball suggestion. If you have Amazon Prime, there is a television show deep buried in Prime that comes from India. It's in Hindi, but it's subtitled. It's called Shaitan Haveli. It's Shaitan Haveli, Haveli. It is an 8-episode, half an hour each long. It's a single season television series about a group of filmmakers who go out to make a horror movie at a haunted mansion. And it is a comedy series that's making fun of Indian horror movies, particularly of the 80s. But you don't need to know that particular subgenre of movies to get everything going on. And it's very funny, and it's very interesting in how it breaks down making films and how this works. And it's just a really entertaining 4 hours of really funny Indian filmmaker comedy. And it's definitely a thing that as writers, you will appreciate how they weave all these storylines together and tell such a really good story. It's called Shaitan Haveli, and I very much recommend it.
Amazing. Appreciate the recommendation. One thing I would also recommend is I personally follow you on Twitter, love reading your stuff on Twitter. It's been particularly insightful and inspirational through what's been a challenging and confusing time. Always just very good things to be checking in on. So I would encourage all of you to check him out on Twitter as well. We went a few minutes over there, so thank you so much for sharing your time. Certainly hope that you are staying healthy, safe, and productive through all of this. I have my fingers crossed that Austin Film Fest will still be on in October, and we'll get.
Oh, there you are. You froze again on me.
Amazing timing. I froze right on my outro. So on that note, thank you for everyone for joining us, and we will see you again soon.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.